The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged mountains of Afghanistan as Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez checked his gear one final time. The weight of his equipment felt familiar against his shoulders, each piece of kit positioned exactly where it had been during countless training exercises back at Coronado. But this wasn't training. This was Operation Silent Thunder, and intelligence suggested the Taliban had established a major weapons cache in the remote village of Kalak, nestled deep in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Rodriguez had been a Navy SEAL for 8 years, long enough to know that every mission carried its own unique dangers. The briefing had been straightforward enough: infiltrate the village, locate and destroy the weapons cache, and extract without engaging the local population unless absolutely necessary. What made this mission particularly challenging was the terrain. Kalak sat in a natural bowl surrounded by steep rocky cliffs and narrow passes. There was essentially one way in and one way out, making it a perfect place for an ambush. The team consisted of 6 highly trained operators. Besides Rodriguez, there was Lieutenant Jake Morrison, the team leader whose calm demeanor under pressure had earned him respect throughout the SEAL community. Petty Officer First Class David Kim brought his expertise as the team's communications specialist and medic. Petty Officer Second Class Tommy "Tank" Williams carried the squad automatic weapon, his massive frame making the heavy gun look almost toy-like in his hands. Petty Officer Third Class Alex Santos served as their explosives expert, capable of turning everyday materials into devastating weapons when needed. Finally, there was Petty Officer Second Class Ryan "Ghost" Patterson, their sniper, whose ability to remain invisible and strike from impossible distances had become legendary within their unit. As they began their approach to the target village, Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this mission. The intelligence had been too clean, too precise. In his experience, real-world operations rarely went according to the neat diagrams drawn up by analysts sitting safely behind desks hundreds of miles away. The enemy had a vote in how things played out, and the Taliban had proven time and again that they were masters of adapting to American tactics. The team moved through the pre-dawn darkness with practiced silence. Each man knew his role, and communication was limited to hand signals and the occasional whispered word into their radio headsets. They had studied satellite images of the area for weeks, memorizing every rock formation, every building, every possible escape route. The plan called for them to establish overwatch positions before sunrise, observe the village throughout the day to identify patterns of life and potential threats, then move in under cover of darkness to complete their mission. Lieutenant Morrison raised his fist, bringing the patrol to an immediate halt. Through the green glow of their night vision goggles, they could see the village spread out below them, exactly as it had appeared in the satellite photos. Small adobe buildings clustered around a central courtyard, with narrow alleyways snaking between them like a maze. A few dogs wandered lazily through the streets, and thin wisps of smoke rose from several chimneys where early risers were preparing breakfast. Patterson, their sniper, immediately began scanning the surrounding ridgelines through his scope. His job was to identify potential threats and provide overwatch for the team. What he saw made his blood run cold. Moving carefully along the ridge opposite their position were at least a dozen armed figures, clearly not local villagers. They were dressed in military-style clothing and carried AK-47s with the confidence of experienced fighters. More concerning was the way they were positioning themselves. They were setting up an ambush. "Contact," Patterson whispered into his radio. "Multiple armed personnel establishing positions on the south ridge. Looks like they're expecting company." Morrison processed this information quickly. The mission had been compromised somehow, but there was no way to know how or when. What mattered now was keeping his team alive and completing their objective if possible. He made a quick decision to modify their approach, using a secondary route that would take them around the village rather than through it. It would add several hours to their timeline, but it might allow them to avoid the trap that was clearly being set. As they began moving toward their new route, Rodriguez noticed movement in the village below. What had appeared to be sleeping residents going about their morning routines was actually something much more sinister. Men were emerging from buildings carrying weapons and moving with military precision. These weren't farmers or shopkeepers. They were fighters, and They had been waiting. The realization hit Morrison like a physical blow. This wasn't just a compromised mission. It was a deliberate trap. Someone had fed false intelligence about a weapons cache to lure a SEAL team into a carefully prepared kill zone. The village wasn't a target. It was bait. And they had walked right into it. Kim, monitoring multiple radio frequencies, picked up chatter that confirmed their worst fears. Taliban fighters were coordinating movements around the entire valley, sealing off escape routes, and moving into position for what they clearly expected to be a major engagement. The numbers being discussed over the radio were sobering. At least 50 fighters, possibly more, all armed and positioned to prevent any American forces from leaving the valley alive. Santos checked his demolition charges, calculating how much explosive power they had available and whether it would be enough to blast their way out of the trap if necessary. Williams adjusted his grip on the squad automatic weapon, knowing that his firepower might be the only thing standing between his team and complete annihilation. Each man was running through his own mental checklist, preparing for what was likely to be the fight of their lives. The irony wasn't lost on Rodriguez. They had come here to destroy a weapons cache that probably didn't exist, and now they were facing a situation where they might need every round of ammunition they carried just to survive. The Taliban had learned from years of fighting American forces, and they had clearly decided that the best way to deal with elite units like the SEALs was to use their own aggressiveness against them. As the sun began to rise over the mountains, casting the rocky landscape in harsh relief, Morrison gathered his team to reassess their situation. They were outnumbered at least 8-1, surrounded on 3 sides, with their only escape route potentially blocked by enemy forces they couldn't see. Their communications with headquarters were being jammed, which meant no immediate hope of air support or extraction. They had enough ammunition for a sustained firefight, but not enough to fight their way through 50 determined Taliban fighters. The lieutenant's mind raced through their options. They could try to evade contact and find another way out of the valley, but the enemy clearly knew they were here and had positioned forces to prevent exactly that kind of escape. They could hunker down and try to wait for rescue, but without communications, no one knew they were in trouble. Or they could take the fight to the enemy, using their superior training and equipment to even the odds. Patterson, still maintaining overwatch, reported additional movement on the ridgelines. The Taliban weren't content to simply wait for the Americans to make a mistake. They were actively maneuvering to tighten the noose, bringing more fighters into position and ensuring that every possible escape route was covered. Time was running out for the SEAL team to make their move. The village below had transformed from a sleepy mountain settlement into a fortified position. Fighters were visible in windows and doorways, weapons positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire across the narrow streets. Machine gun positions had been established at key intersections, and Rodriguez could see the distinctive shapes of rocket-propelled grenades being moved into position. The Taliban had turned the entire village into a deadly maze designed to channel any attacking force into predetermined kill zones. Williams reported movement to their rear as well. A group of at least 10 fighters was moving up the same path the SEAL team had used to approach the village. The trap was nearly complete, and soon they would be surrounded with nowhere to run. The weight of their situation pressed down on each man, but their training kicked in automatically. Fear was a luxury they couldn't afford, and doubt would only get them killed. Kim managed to establish brief contact with their headquarters, broadcasting their GPS coordinates and a terse situation report before the jamming resumed. It wasn't much, but it was something. If they didn't make it out alive, at least someone would know where to find their bodies and potentially piece together what had happened. More importantly, the information might prevent other teams from walking into similar traps in the future. The sound of diesel engines echoed off the rocky walls of the valley as 2 pickup trucks loaded with fighters drove into the village from the north. Fresh reinforcements, Rodriguez realized, watching as more than a dozen additional Taliban fighters dismounted and took up positions. The odds, already heavily stacked against the SEALs, had just gotten worse. Morrison made his decision. They couldn't outrun the enemy, they couldn't hide from them, and they couldn't call for help. That left only one option. They would have to fight their way out. But not in the conventional sense. Rather than trying to break through the enemy lines by brute force, they would use their superior marksmanship and tactical knowledge to inflict maximum casualties while minimizing their own exposure. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one that offered any hope of survival. The lieutenant quickly outlined his strategy to the team. They would split into 3 two-man teams and establish positions on the high ground overlooking the village. From there, they would engage selected targets, forcing the Taliban to react to multiple threats while avoiding decisive engagement themselves. The goal wasn't to win a traditional firefight. It was to create enough confusion and chaos to open up an escape route. Patterson would remain in his current position as the primary sniper, picking off high-value targets and disrupting enemy communications. Rodriguez and Kim would move to a position on the eastern ridge, providing flanking fire and medical support if needed. Williams and Santos would take the western approach, using the squad automatic weapon and demolition charges to create maximum disruption among enemy positions. As they prepared to separate, each man checked his equipment one final time. Ammunition was redistributed to ensure each team had what they needed for their specific mission. Radio frequencies were confirmed, and backup communication plans were established in case their primary radios failed. Most importantly, they synchronized their watches and established a timeline for the operation. They would begin the attack at exactly 0800 hours, giving each team enough time to reach their designated positions. The plan was simple in concept, but would be extremely difficult to execute. Success would require perfect timing, exceptional marksmanship, and more than a little luck. One mistake, one missed shot, one moment of hesitation could doom the entire team. But these were Navy SEALs, and impossible missions were exactly what they had trained their entire careers to accomplish. Rodriguez felt the familiar calm that always settled over him before combat. Fear was still there, lurking in the background, but it was controlled and channeled into heightened awareness and razor-sharp focus. His hands moved automatically through his final equipment checks, muscle memory taking over as his mind began calculating ranges, wind patterns, and escape routes. The mountains around them seemed to hold their breath as the 6 warriors prepared to fight for their lives against overwhelming odds. In less than an hour, this peaceful valley would erupt into violence that would test every skill they had learned and every ounce of courage they possessed. Some of them might not survive the next few hours, but they would make the enemy pay dearly for every yard of ground. As the teams began to separate and move toward their assigned positions, each man carried with him the knowledge that they were about to face the ultimate test of their training, their equipment, and their brotherhood. The Taliban thought they had trapped 6 Americans in this remote valley. They were about to discover that they had actually caged 6 of the most dangerous warriors in the world. The stage was set for a battle that would be remembered and studied for years to come, a fight that would demonstrate once again why the Navy SEALs had earned their reputation as the most elite fighting force on Earth. The enemy had the numbers and the terrain advantage, but the Americans had something far more valuable, the unshakable belief that no matter what the odds, they would find a way to complete their mission and bring each other home alive. At exactly 0800 hours, Patterson's rifle spoke first. The sound echoed off the rocky walls of the valley like thunder, and 800 meters away, a Taliban fighter who had been directing troop movements dropped instantly. The man had been using a radio, coordinating the positioning of fighters throughout the village, and his death would create immediate confusion in the enemy ranks. Rodriguez and Kim had reached their position on the eastern ridge just minutes before the attack began. From their vantage point, they could see into the courtyard where Taliban fighters were gathered around several vehicles. Kim began calling out targets while Rodriguez prepared his rifle for precision shooting. The range was considerable, nearly 600 meters, but both men had made longer shots during training. Williams and Santos were in position on the western approach, the squad automatic weapon already trained on a machine gun nest that had been established near the village entrance. Santos had identified several buildings that appeared to be ammunition storage points, and his demolition charges were prepared for strategic deployment once the firefight began in earnest. The response to Patterson's first shot was immediate and violent. Taliban fighters throughout the village began firing wildly in all directions, not yet sure where the attack was coming from. Muzzle flashes lit up windows and doorways as automatic weapons chattered in sustained bursts. The sound was deafening, echoing and re-echoing off the rocky walls until it became a continuous roar of gunfire. Rodriguez took his first shot, targeting a fighter who was trying to set up a mortar in the village courtyard. The man spun and fell, and the mortar tube clanged uselessly against the stone pavement. Immediately, Kim called out a second target, another fighter attempting to man a heavy machine gun positioned to cover the main approach to the village. Rodriguez's second shot was just as accurate as his first, and the machine gun fell silent. From his position, Patterson could see the entire battlefield spread out below him like a deadly game board. Through his scope, he watched as Taliban fighters tried to organize their response to the coordinated attack. A group of men were attempting to move a rocket-propelled grenade launcher into position to target what they believed was the Americans' location. Patterson's rifle cracked again, and the RPG team scattered as their leader fell. Williams opened fire with the squad automatic weapon, sending long bursts of suppressive fire into the village entrance where a concentration of fighters had been attempting to set up a defensive position. The heavy bullets chewed through adobe walls and wooden barriers, forcing the enemy to seek deeper cover and disrupting their attempts to organize a coordinated response. The Taliban fighters were experienced warriors, and despite the initial confusion, they began to adapt quickly to the threat. Small teams started moving through the village's narrow alleyways, using the buildings for cover as they attempted to locate and flank the American positions. Radio chatter increased as surviving leaders tried to regain control of their forces and develop a plan to eliminate the SEAL team. Santos identified his first target for demolition, a building that appeared to house a significant ammunition cache based on the number of fighters moving in and out of it. He fired a single 40mm grenade from his launcher, and the building erupted in a massive secondary explosion that shook the entire valley. Flames and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air as stored ammunition and explosives cooked off in a chain reaction that lasted for several minutes. The explosion had an immediate psychological effect on the Taliban fighters. Many of them had taken cover in buildings throughout the village, and the realization that those same buildings might be targeted for demolition caused widespread panic. Fighters began abandoning their prepared positions and moving into the open, making themselves vulnerable to the accurate rifle fire of the SEAL snipers. Rodriguez and Kim took advantage of the confusion to engage multiple targets rapidly. Working as a team, Kim would spot and call out targets while Rodriguez engaged them with precise rifle fire. In the span of 2 minutes, they eliminated 6 fighters who had been attempting to coordinate a counterattack from the village's eastern edge. Patterson, from his elevated position, could see Taliban reinforcements arriving from the north. 3 more vehicles loaded with fighters were approaching fast, and he realized that the situation was about to become even more desperate for his team. He shifted his aim to target the driver of the lead vehicle, hoping to create a roadblock that would delay the arrival of additional enemy forces. His shot was perfect, and the lead truck veered off the narrow mountain road, rolling twice before coming to rest against a large boulder. The other vehicles stopped to assist the survivors, buying the SEAL team precious minutes before they would have to deal with even more enemies. But Patterson could see that those minutes wouldn't be enough. There were simply too many Taliban fighters converging on their position. Williams was running through ammunition at a concerning rate as he tried to suppress multiple enemy positions simultaneously. The squad automatic weapon was devastating when properly employed, but it consumed bullets rapidly, and their resupply options were non-existent. He began firing shorter, more controlled bursts, trying to maximize the effectiveness of each round while conserving ammunition for the prolonged fight he knew was coming. The Taliban fighters had begun to coordinate their movements more effectively, and Rodriguez noticed that they were attempting to encircle the American positions. Groups of fighters were moving along the ridgelines on both flanks, clearly planning to get behind the SEALs and eliminate their escape routes. If they succeeded, the mission would transform from a fighting withdrawal into a desperate last stand. Kim reported movement to their rear, at least 8 Taliban fighters climbing the rocky slope behind their position. They had perhaps 10 minutes before those fighters would be in position to attack from behind, trapping Rodriguez and Kim on the ridge with nowhere to retreat. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and all three teams were about to face attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. Santos launched another grenade into a group of fighters who were attempting to set up a heavy machine gun position. The explosion scattered the team and destroyed their weapon, but he noticed that his ammunition supply was running dangerously low. Each grenade had to count from this point forward, and he began looking for the most lucrative targets rather than simply trying to suppress enemy movements. The sound of the battle had attracted attention from far beyond the immediate area. Patterson could see dust clouds in the distance that indicated more vehicles approaching the valley. Intelligence estimates of 50 Taliban fighters were proving to be conservative. It looked like they would soon be facing twice that number. The trap had been even more elaborate and well-coordinated than they had initially realized. Rodriguez made a difficult decision. He and Kim would have to abandon their current position before the flanking force could get behind them. But moving in broad daylight across the rocky terrain would expose them to fire from dozens of enemy positions throughout the village. It was an almost impossible situation, but staying put meant certain death or capture. Williams and Santos were facing a similar dilemma. Taliban fighters had begun moving up both sides of their position, and their ammunition situation was becoming critical. The squad automatic weapon had perhaps 5 minutes of sustained fire remaining, and Santos was down to his last 3 grenades. They needed to move, but any movement would trigger a massive volume of enemy fire. Patterson realized that his team was on the verge of being completely surrounded. From his vantage point, he could see the coordinated movement of Taliban fighters as they closed the trap around the 3 SEAL positions. In perhaps 15 minutes, all escape routes would be sealed, and his brothers-in-arms would be forced into a hopeless fighting position with no chance of survival. The sniper began calculating ranges and priorities, trying to determine how he could best support his team's escape efforts. He had plenty of ammunition remaining, but he was only one man with 1 rifle. Even with perfect accuracy, he couldn't engage all of the threats that were converging on his teammates' positions. He would have to choose his targets carefully, focusing on the enemy fighters who posed the greatest threat to his team's survival. Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, cutting through the chaos of battle with calm professionalism. He had been monitoring the situation from his command position and could see that all 3 teams were in immediate danger of being overrun. His order was simple and direct: execute the emergency extraction plan immediately, regardless of the risks involved. The emergency extraction plan was something they had hoped never to use. It involved all 3 teams moving simultaneously toward a predetermined rally point while providing mutual supporting fire. It was dangerous in the extreme, requiring the teams to expose themselves while crossing open ground under enemy fire. But it was their only remaining option for avoiding complete annihilation. Rodriguez and Kim began their movement first, bounding across the rocky terrain in short rushes while providing covering fire for each other. Taliban bullets whined off the rocks around them, and several rounds passed close enough that they could feel the pressure waves. But their movement seemed to confuse the enemy fighters, who had been expecting the Americans to remain in their defensive positions. Williams opened fire with everything he had, sending long bursts into the village to cover his teammates' movement. The squad automatic weapon hammered out a steady rhythm, forcing Taliban fighters to seek cover just as Rodriguez and Kim were most vulnerable. Santos added his remaining grenades to the suppressive fire, targeting concentrations of enemy fighters and creating smoke and confusion throughout the village. Patterson shifted his focus to the fighters who were climbing toward Rodriguez and Kim's former position. His rifle cracked repeatedly as he engaged the flanking force, dropping 2 fighters and forcing the others to take cover. Every shot had to count now, and he was demonstrating exactly why SEAL snipers were considered among the best in the world. The movement toward the rally point was a nightmare of flying bullets and exploding grenades. Taliban fighters seemed to be everywhere, firing from windows, doorways, and concealed positions throughout the rocky landscape. The volume of enemy fire was so intense that the air itself seemed to buzz with the passage of bullets, and the sound was overwhelming. Kim was hit first, a Taliban bullet catching him in the leg and spinning him to the ground. Rodriguez immediately stopped his own movement to provide aid, dragging his wounded teammate behind a large boulder while calling for covering fire from the other teams. Blood was soaking through Kim's uniform, and it was clear that he would need immediate medical attention to prevent shock from blood loss. Williams and Santos began their own movement toward the rally point, but they were immediately engaged by multiple enemy positions. Williams' squad automatic weapon jammed after a piece of brass became lodged in the action, leaving him with only his sidearm while Taliban fighters closed in from 3 directions. Santos was down to his last grenade and his rifle, facing at least a dozen enemy fighters who were moving aggressively to overrun their position. The situation had become desperate beyond anything they had trained for. 3 of the 6 SEALs were wounded or trapped, ammunition was running critically low, and enemy fighters were closing in from all directions. In a few more minutes, the trap would be complete, and the most elite warriors in the American military would be facing annihilation in this remote mountain valley. Patterson could see it all unfolding below him through his scope. His teammates were fighting with desperate courage against impossible odds, but mathematics and ammunition supply were working against them. He had to do something dramatic to change the dynamics of the battle, but he was only one man with a rifle against more than 100 enemy fighters. Then, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Moving along the ridge opposite his position was a Taliban sniper team, carrying a large caliber rifle and optical equipment. They were positioning themselves to target his teammates with precision fire, and from their elevated position, they would be able to engage the Americans regardless of what cover they found. The enemy sniper was setting up in a natural hide position among the rocks, perhaps 600 meters from Patterson's location. It was a difficult shot even under ideal conditions, and the stress of combat made it exponentially more challenging. But Patterson knew that if he didn't eliminate this threat immediately, the Taliban sniper would systematically pick off his teammates one by one. He adjusted his scope, calculated the range and wind conditions, and steadied his breathing as he had been trained to do thousands of times before. Through his scope, he could see the enemy sniper settling into position, preparing to take his first shot at the Americans below. It was a race against time, and whoever fired first would likely determine the outcome of the entire battle. Patterson's finger tightened on the trigger just as the enemy sniper raised his rifle toward the Americans below. The distance was extreme, the target was partially concealed, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Patterson had made thousands of practice shots, but never one that mattered as much as this single squeeze of the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and through his scope, Patterson watched the enemy sniper jerk backward and disappear behind the rocks. But he couldn't be sure if it was a hit or if the man had simply taken cover. Either way, the immediate threat to his teammates had been neutralized, at least temporarily. He kept his scope trained on the position, watching for any sign of movement. Rodriguez had managed to stop Kim's bleeding and fashion a field dressing from their medical kit. Kim was conscious and alert, but he wouldn't be able to move quickly with his wounded leg. Rodriguez faced an agonizing decision: leave his wounded teammate behind to save himself, or stay and fight knowing that both of them would probably die in the process. For a Navy SEAL, it wasn't really a decision at all. Williams had cleared the jam in his weapon and was back in action, but his ammunition situation was critical. He had perhaps 2 minutes of sustained fire remaining, and Taliban fighters were advancing on his position from 3 different directions. Santos was beside him, down to his sidearm, and a single fragmentation grenade. They were making their stand behind a natural wall of rocks, but the enemy was close enough now that they could hear voices shouting orders in Dari and Pashto. The rally point that had been designated for emergency extraction was still 200 meters away across open ground. With Kim wounded and unable to move quickly, and with Taliban fighters converging from all directions, reaching that position seemed impossible. But Lieutenant Morrison had identified an alternative, a narrow canyon that cut through the ridge about 300 meters to the north of their current positions. The canyon offered the possibility of concealment and cover, but reaching it would require the teams to cross the most exposed ground yet. Worse, intelligence had indicated that Taliban fighters were positioned throughout that area as well, and moving toward the canyon might simply be walking into another prepared ambush. But, with ammunition running low and enemy forces closing in, they were running out of alternatives. Patterson continued his overwatch, engaging targets of opportunity while trying to provide covering fire for his teammates' movements. He had eliminated the sniper threat for the moment, but other enemy fighters were moving into position to replace the fallen marksman. His ammunition supply was better than the others, but he was still operating under the constraint of having to make every shot count. Rodriguez made the decision to begin moving toward the canyon with Kim, knowing that staying in their current position meant certain death or capture. He helped his wounded teammate to his feet and began the treacherous journey across the rocky terrain, moving from cover to cover while Taliban bullets cracked overhead and sparked off the rocks around them. The volume of enemy fire was incredible. It seemed as though every Taliban fighter in the valley was concentrating their weapons on the moving Americans, creating a nearly solid wall of bullets that made movement extremely dangerous. Rodriguez could feel the heat of passing rounds and hear the distinctive whine of near misses as he half-carried, half-dragged Kim from one position to the next. Williams and Santos began their own movement, but they were immediately engaged by a group of Taliban fighters who had worked their way to within 50 meters of their position. Williams opened fire with short bursts, trying to conserve ammunition while keeping the enemy at bay. Santos saved his last grenade, knowing that they might need it for a final desperate attempt to break contact. Patterson could see the entire drama unfolding below him, and he began engaging targets systematically to support his teammates' movement. His rifle found target after target. A fighter with an RPG who was preparing to engage Rodriguez, and Kim, a machine gunner who was setting up to interdict the canyon approach, a group of Taliban fighters who were attempting to flank Williams and Santos. But for every enemy fighter that Patterson eliminated, two more seemed to appear. The Taliban had committed an enormous force to this operation, and they were willing to accept significant casualties to ensure that the American team didn't escape. Radio intercepts suggested that they had orders to take prisoners if possible, but to ensure that none of the SEALs left the valley alive. Rodriguez and Kim made it to within 100 meters of the canyon entrance before they were pinned down by concentrated fire from at least 3 different positions. Bullets were striking all around them, and chunks of rock were flying in every direction as high-powered rounds shattered against the stone walls. Kim was losing blood despite Rodriguez's field dressing, and his condition was deteriorating rapidly. Williams was down to his last magazine when Taliban fighters began their final assault on his position. They came from 3 directions simultaneously, firing as they advanced, and clearly intending to overrun the American position through sheer numbers. Santos pulled the pin on his last grenade and threw it into the largest group of advancing fighters, buying them perhaps 30 more seconds before they would be overwhelmed. The grenade explosion temporarily scattered the attacking fighters, but Williams could see more Taliban reinforcements moving up behind them. He and Santos had perhaps 1 minute before they would be forced to fight with nothing but their sidearms against dozens of enemy fighters armed with automatic weapons. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. They were about to be overrun and killed. Patterson realized that his teammates were on the verge of being annihilated, and he made a desperate decision. Abandoning his concealed sniper position, he began moving rapidly along the ridge toward a position where he could provide more effective supporting fire. It meant exposing himself to enemy observation and fire, but his current position was too distant to provide the kind of close support his teammates needed. As he moved, Patterson could see Taliban fighters streaming into the valley from multiple directions. The force that had been assembled to destroy the SEAL team was much larger than anyone had anticipated, probably close to 150 fighters, all armed and motivated to eliminate the Americans. His team had walked into a trap of unprecedented scale and sophistication. Rodriguez was trying to find a way to move Kim the final distance to the canyon when he noticed movement on the ridge above them. At first, he thought it was more Taliban fighters positioning themselves for an attack, but then he recognized the distinctive outline of American equipment. Someone was moving along the high ground, and whoever it was, they were engaging enemy positions with accurate rifle fire. The mysterious figure on the ridge was systematically engaging Taliban fighters who were threatening the SEAL team's movement toward the canyon. Rodriguez watched through his scope as enemy fighters fell one after another, picked off by someone who clearly had exceptional marksmanship skills and intimate knowledge of the tactical situation. But who was it? And how had they gotten into position? Williams and Santos were fighting for their lives when automatic weapons fire erupted from the ridge above them, engaging the Taliban fighters who were attempting to overrun their position. The enemy fighters, caught by surprise from an unexpected direction, scattered to find cover, giving the two SEALs a brief respite from the overwhelming pressure they had been facing. Patterson had reached his new position and was engaging targets rapidly, but he wasn't the only one providing supporting fire. Someone else was operating from a different position on the ridge, someone with a heavy-caliber rifle who was making shots at extreme range with devastating accuracy. The mystery sniper was picking off Taliban commanders and weapon crews, creating confusion in the enemy ranks. The identity of the unknown sniper became clear when a familiar voice crackled over the radio. Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez, a Marine Corps sniper who had been operating independently in the area, had heard the firefight and moved to assist. She had been tracking a Taliban supply convoy when the battle erupted, and she had immediately positioned herself to provide supporting fire for the embattled SEALs. Vasquez had been operating alone in these mountains for 3 weeks, gathering intelligence on Taliban movement patterns and supply routes. Her high position was perfectly situated to observe the entire valley, and when she saw the SEAL team being overwhelmed, she didn't hesitate to reveal her position and join the fight. Her rifle was a .338 Lapua Magnum, capable of making accurate shots at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. With Vasquez providing supporting fire from her concealed position, the tactical situation began to change dramatically. Taliban fighters who had been advancing confidently were suddenly taking casualties from an unseen sniper who seemed to be everywhere at once. Command and control began breaking down as leaders were systematically eliminated, and the coordinated assault started to fragment into smaller, less effective actions. Rodriguez was able to move Kim the final distance to the canyon entrance with Vasquez providing overwatch. Her rifle cracked repeatedly as she engaged Taliban fighters who were trying to intercept the wounded SEAL and his partner. Each shot was perfectly placed, and enemy fighters began abandoning their positions rather than risk being targeted by the mysterious sniper. Williams and Santos fought their way to the canyon as well, supported by both Patterson and Vasquez. The combined firepower of 2 expert marksmen was enough to suppress the Taliban fighters long enough for the team to reach relative safety in the narrow passage. But they weren't safe yet. The canyon was a potential trap itself, and Taliban fighters would certainly attempt to follow them into the confined space. Patterson began moving toward the canyon to rejoin his team, but he was spotted by a group of Taliban fighters who had been searching for the source of the deadly accurate fire that had been decimating their ranks. He found himself engaged in a running firefight as he bounded from rock to rock, trying to reach his teammates while avoiding the concentrated fire of at least a dozen enemy fighters. Vasquez shifted her fire to cover Patterson's movement, engaging the Taliban fighters who were pursuing him. Her rifle found target after target, forcing the enemy to seek cover and disrupting their pursuit. But she could see more fighters moving along the ridgeline toward her own position, and she knew that she would soon have to abandon her hide and relocate to avoid being overrun. The 6 SEALs had finally managed to reach the canyon, but Kim was in serious condition and needed immediate medical attention. The canyon offered concealment from observation, but it was also a confined space that would be difficult to defend if Taliban fighters managed to get above them on the ridgelines. They needed to keep moving, but Kim's condition was slowing them down significantly. Lieutenant Morrison took stock of their situation. They had survived the immediate trap and inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy, but they were still deep in hostile territory with a wounded teammate and limited ammunition. Their communications with headquarters remained intermittent, and they had no idea when or if extraction would be available. Most importantly, they owed their lives to a Marine sniper who had risked everything to help them. Vasquez appeared at the canyon entrance just as Taliban fighters began moving into position to seal off the passage. She had been forced to abandon her sniper position when enemy fighters got too close, but she had brought her rifle and remaining ammunition with her. Her presence gave the team an additional expert marksman and someone with detailed knowledge of the local area. The combined American force now consisted of 7 highly trained warriors, but they were still heavily outnumbered and operating in extremely hostile territory. Taliban fighters were regrouping and preparing for another assault, and radio intercepts suggested that additional reinforcements were en route. The battle was far from over, and the most dangerous part might still be ahead. Kim's condition stabilized with proper medical attention from the team's medic, but he would need evacuation as soon as possible. The wound was serious enough to prevent him from participating effectively in any further combat operations, and infection was a serious concern given the primitive conditions and limited medical supplies available. As they prepared to move deeper into the canyon, Patterson reflected on the events of the past few hours. They had been lured into an elaborate trap by an enemy that had studied American tactics and prepared accordingly. Only exceptional marksmanship, tactical flexibility, and the unexpected intervention of a Marine sniper had prevented their complete annihilation. But they were still a long way from safety. The canyon stretched ahead of them, a narrow passage between towering rock walls that offered both concealment and the potential for another ambush. Taliban fighters would certainly attempt to get ahead of them and block their exit, turning the canyon into a killing ground. The Americans would have to move quickly and carefully, using all of their skills to avoid walking into yet another trap. Behind them, they could hear the voices of Taliban fighters as they organized for pursuit. The enemy had suffered significant casualties, but they still had overwhelming numerical superiority and intimate knowledge of the local terrain. The chase that was about to begin would test every skill the Americans possessed and push them to the very limits of their endurance and courage. Staff Sergeant Vasquez took point, using her knowledge of the area to guide the team through the treacherous terrain ahead. Her intervention had saved their lives, and now she would help lead them to safety. But the mountains of Afghanistan were unforgiving, and their enemies were determined to ensure that none of them would live to tell the story of what had happened in this remote valley. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Somewhere ahead lay safety and extraction, but between here and there waited an unknown number of enemy fighters who were determined to complete the mission they had started. The most dangerous part of Operation Silent Thunder was just beginning.